Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proof.
This is Dan.
This
Stone.
is Dexter from The Offspring.
Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is David Lapp.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick
I'm
Gillette.
Christopher
This is
Knopf.
Dr. Bob Greenberg.
I'm Laird Hamilton.
This is Rob Bell. Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, I'm Mark Valley.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Jack Barsky. I'm a retired and reformed undercover KGB agent. I'm now in my sixth career as an author and public speaker. The book that I published last year in March is called The Deep Undercover, soon to come out in German under the translated title The False American, which I really like.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero, Mark Valley, and Pete A. Turner.
Well, welcome to the Break It Down Show, Jack. This is Pete flying solo. This is one of these, I keep finding my way into these spy versus spy conversations, and if you don't know Jack's story already, let me stop you, and you need to pull up jackbarsky.com, Barsky's B-A-R-S-K-Y.com, and go take a look at his website. His book is called Deep Undercover. It's available on Amazon, and if you know the show The Americans, this is what Jack did, but for real. So, KGB spy, born in East Germany, comes over here under basically he assumes someone's identity and starts to live a life as an American. There's a lot of this is covered on his 60 Minutes episode. A lot of this is covered in a fantastic 2-part Art of Charm podcast with my man Jordan Harbinger. I encourage all of you guys to go consume those things. I think Jack and I are going to cover new ground. Because what you don't want to hear is some reporter who lived in New York his whole life talking to a spy. You can get that on 60 Minutes. But what you can't get is two dudes that do spy work hitting the ball back and forth. And so I'm positive Jack's going to ask me questions and I'm going to ask him. And we're going to have a conversation that literally you cannot find anywhere else, because we have both been out there where we had to build trust to live, and both of us are standing here going, I don't know how I'm alive. I don't know how we did it, man.
Well, quite frankly, because of the distance of time, to me, sometimes it feels totally unreal, and I have to that I did what I did because for the last almost 30 years, I lived the life of a normal middle-class American who I truly have become. And then I got this other thing in my past, and the only reason I know it's real is because there's confirmation. I left a trace back to 2 sons in East Germany. I got the FBI records, so in touch with FBI. I met one of my friends yesterday. So it's real, but it feels like I'm looking at a different person from the outside. I don't know if you have that much distance with regard to your own career, but at one point, if you become normal, if you can, which by the way is not that easy, and I have I've met a couple of other people who did undercover work. Most recently, somebody who worked for the DEA in South America, and it is not easy to become a normal functioning person. And if and when you do, then you look back and say, what does that mean?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of favors you're granted. Just as an example, in a combat zone, I'm allowed to drink whiskey. I'm allowed to do a lot of things that other people aren't, because I have to hang out with people that do things that soldiers, service members under military rules and laws can't do. So there's actual regulations where I get to drink alcohol when I'm deployed, and I've drank a lot of it, because that's what everybody else is doing around.
I can probably trump that in a big way. I was allowed by my own government to break every darn law other than, committing like straightforward crimes, but laws that were in place because I was a special guy, and I was allowed to go out and be on my own, and pretty much I broke probably a couple of hundred laws in more than a dozen countries, including the Soviet Union and the German country where I was born and raised.
And part of that reindoctrination into real life is that norm where we get to break all these rules and go do all these incredible, exciting things, that all goes away. We have to stand in line again. And that really is a tough Yeah, right.
You
It's tough.
absolutely, without probably knowing it specifically, you hit one of my weak points when during my career in corporate America, I had a tendency to make really quick decisions. They were mostly good, but they were too quick, and I didn't ask every Tom, Dick, and Harry to see if that to get their buy-in, because I was so used to making my own decisions. Because and during my 10 active years, I had nobody to run things by. I just had to make that decision. And sometimes it was maybe not life and death, but jail or no jail. And so compared to that, whether I spend $100,000 of company money or not, it was Mickey Mouse.
Right. Yeah, no, I definitely was a wild horse. When I would come back, I'd be in the field and I would stay out there at all costs because that's really where the work was. But every now and then, and you know this, you have to report back and talk. Otherwise, what you're doing, you don't get to keep doing it. You have to be able to communicate what you're seeing and interacting with in the field. And I would come back and I would know in my head, they all see me as this wild man who's out front doing impossible things. I'm acting like a wild horse, and just have completely different perspectives on everything. So I've got to work on building a filter to push all this stuff through so that I'm normal enough that the folks on the inside can accept me. Because I had to build trust, Jack. I had to build trust in both ways, because I could be virtually dead in the brigade conference room, to the military commanders, because they couldn't rely on me. They couldn't believe me.
Yeah. Two questions here. A, were you prepared for that duality of existence? Because I don't believe I was. And B, this is more of a rhetorical question. I'm assuming this wild man was held in high regard. It was sort of the one that everybody else wanted to be but couldn't or wouldn't, whatever. Because I got that kind of treatment. Sometimes I felt like almost like a circus animal when I went back to Moscow and we had this banquet, and all of a sudden a couple of highly placed officers showed up, and I was being paraded in front of them as, hey, look, this is the guy.
Right. Yes. I had no idea that I would spend, in my case, most of my time studying and understanding and building trust on the American side. I had no idea that was a thing. So I was always on the move, always having meetings, impromptu engaging with those guys because, I needed to build influence on that side. And then once the commander figured out what I was doing, that was it. Game over. I was a bit of a celebrity over there, so I would show up, and it was great. Jack, like one of the times they said, we're trying to work on media and trying to figure all these things out. Hey, Pete, the guys in this really dangerous area over there. Tell us what do you think? And this is an impossible question. What's the TV channel they watch the most? And I've really been set up. Like, how in the world am I supposed to know this? Well, here was the answer, and I get to look at the senior State Department person who's a super high level guy and go, there's no electricity out there. They don't even watch TV. And that reality shook those guys to their core, that I could instantly answer this question in a way that none of them saw coming, and completely changed how they had to approach the problem. So my status was, I had in the Army especially, the commander sits up there, and when they say, I think, everybody grabs their pen and writes down what he thinks, and they want to accomplish that thing. So when he looks and points at my partner Rich and I and goes, before we start this meeting, these two guys are going to talk, and I want you to listen to what they're going to say. Anything he says after that is all like, who the fuck are those guys in the back row? And so for sure, that celebrity status, I get being paraded around because that for sure happened to us.
Yeah. That's an interesting thought here, and it's important, which this rule in my mind has been violated so many times in my presence, that the leader listens to the people who have the knowledge and the expertise. Particularly in corporate America, I've found so many leaders that with their big egos who think that they know everything, and it's exactly the opposite. And so and actually, the KGB folks did respect my decisions, almost never second guessed me because I was the expert in the field, and they didn't have a clue, and they actually knew that they didn't have a clue.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic because one of the things I would do is I would go out on reports or out on patrols and write reports in support of that patrol. But there's 10 other people also writing reports, and when they all have a common story, and I'm getting information that no one else is getting, you can become obsolete really fast, or you can be this person that they want to know more from. The other thing I had to do as I built trust was I had to build my reading list, Jack. So I had to okay, there's a guy who handles ag. I need that guy to know he has access to my reports. But I have to also check and say, are you reading my reports? And then, of course, they say, yes, of course, I'm reading your report. And then I get to look at this guy who outranks me by a mile and say, what has changed or what has stood out? And then I look the guy right in the eye, like a guy like you and I can do, knowing the guy has always just shined me on, and he'll go, you know what, Pete? I didn't read it. And I'm like, and it's totally fine. I just want you to know I'm going to send them to you, and I want these things to be helpful. So interact with me whenever you can. So I've done a couple things. One, I got that guy to call me Pete, right? That's a measure of affect for me. Like, okay, this guy sees me as Pete, not Mr. Turner, not Sir, or whatever. I've also got this guy to know, like, oh crap, this guy's going to hold me accountable, and I'm not the only guy that's going to get this thing. Everybody's going to get it. I better make sure I'm in the know. And so slowly I would build this, amass a lot of readers who wanted to engage with me, wanted to read my reports. Because when the boss came out and said, I read Pete and Rich's report, everybody else better had read it. So that built a lot of authority, but I had to build that authority myself. Your authority, I think, is different, though, because you're in such a remote place doing such impossible stuff. Whatever you say, I'm guessing is gold, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I had no idea. I was kept in the dark. And this is when you were deep undercover and your true identity may be known to 3-4 people at the most. Other than that, I was known under a code name. I never got any feedback as to the usefulness, the value of information, whatever it was. I sent. It was sending. I never delivered anything in person, and I never knew who read or didn't read it. I didn't even know who my boss was. Quite literally, for the book, what I made up for the book to make it digestible for the reader. I made up a composite of a number of people that I met over the years. This guy was sort of a little more often in my space, but was he my boss? I had no idea.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It goes to the complexity of what we have to do. And I'm dying to ask you what you thought about Hillary Clinton's email server with top secret, because we both know what lives on top secret. Guys like us, our names are on there attached to an operation. And it's like, oh my God, you had that in your garage. But I'm not going to ask you that question. I just want to throw that bit of paint out there and come back to, okay, so you're producing these things. One of the things that people don't realize is the amount of prep and detail that has to be done to communicate back to, especially for a strategic guy like you, back to home. So you're doing burst transmissions on radio, maybe you're doing micro dots to communicate pictures and those kinds of things. You're absolutely doing surveillance detection routes, surveillance countermeasures, each of those individual things that can sometimes overlap. Talk about a little bit about the amount of work you had to do that had nothing to do with producing a product and everything to do with keeping your
I would say it was probably 90% overhead and 10% what you would call real work. Just as an example, I was trained to do microdots, but I never used that. And I didn't do electronic transmissions. Whatever I sent was either photographic and an undeveloped 35 millimeter film or whatever that old cartridge was, or secret writing in a letter. So now here's and most of this was per letter and secret writing, two pages, no more, with printed letters that shouldn't be too small, because when they developed this stuff, It was rather smudgy. It was extremely sensitive. 2 pages worth of information. Very often, at least a half a page was overhead also, because I had to submit a finance report, believe it or not. They were very meticulous about it. Well, and ultimately I became a beneficiary of this, or at least my German family, because, as I was working here, they also paid me a salary, and the money, added up, and eventually there was about $60,000 that has been used by my son last year as a down payment for his house, but that's another story. Anyway, so this is the overhead. I'm getting a request through shortwave radio, and that would take about 2 to 3 hours to first write it down and then decrypt it, and then I let it sit. That would be on a Thursday. Then I needed more time, so typically on a Saturday, I would sit down and write whatever I had to write. First, I had to compose an open letter, like a normal letter. I'm writing to a fictitious friend. Dear so-and-so, it's been nice to hear from you. It's wonderful that you're in good spirits. A bunch of nonsense, but make it sound as if you have a relationship. And then you start making things up about, I was sick. And so I have pretty good imagination, so that wasn't that hard, but it still took a while. And for quite some time, I had to write this in Spanish, because the convenience address that I got was in South America, and I was self-trained in Spanish, so I could write Spanish reasonably well. So anyway, that takes about an hour. Now you do that secret writing stuff. So this is so you use a contact paper that was impregnated with some kind of a chemical, and then you very meticulously and carefully write this. Then you destroy, and you do this with a pencil, and you destroy the paper you wrote this on, put your contact paper back, make sure that there were no traces. And oh, by the way, I was supposed to use rubber gloves, or latex, and I didn't like that. So I had to make sure that every time I touched something, I used my knuckles to move things around, right? All awkward, right? And then you destroy the paper that you wrote on, you put this thing in an envelope, and now you spend another 3 to 4 hours walking around in the city, taking public transportation, so forth, until you get to a point where you are reasonably certain that you're not being followed, and then you drop this thing in a mailbox someplace near the fictitious return address. All right, there goes the day.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So this is kind of a funny story. I did some surveillance validation training on a U.S. contract. That's all I can really say about that part of the job. But they wanted to make sure that we knew how to do surveillance, brush up, any old skills, knock some rust off. And so we did all of the surveillance stuff. And it was funny. I forgot how much nothing there is in that job, but it has to absolutely be done so that you can account for it. You can be good at surveilling and understand what counter surveillance is, and be ready to do all the work to prevent the surveillance. So many hours. So anyhow, the whole thing, the whole exercise, the practical that we had to do completes literally on me hopping into an actual cab and pointing and say, follow that car. I actually got to say this. Yeah. And then the guy's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, my girlfriend just got into that car. I got to see where she's going. And then in my ear, so the guy's like, oh, okay. And he's kind of troubled by it, but it's a good cover, that's going to work. And then in my ear, I hear them call the end of the exercise. They don't know that I've said follow that car, but they do know that I'm in the cab about to follow the rabbit that we're following. And they go end exercise, index. And so I look at the guy, and now I've got to end this thing. So I don't want to keep following this car. So I've got to explain in a way that makes sense. Even though this is practice, this really is a cab driver. He doesn't need to know what I'm doing. So I go, damn it. You know what? I need to let this go. Go ahead and just drop me off. And the guy's like, yes, this is the right answer. You don't need this trouble. That's so awesome. I'm like, damn, I'm good at this.
Interesting. You are sort of on the other side of what I did, and I
Yes.
did about between 10 and a dozen practice runs in Moscow, and it was a game. It was a game because I was told, no matter what, when you do that and you are being followed, the folks that you're following you will know that you are checking yourself. However, you need to behave in such a way that your behavior can be explained and cannot be used as evidence in court. So, when I go to 3 different department stores and take the subway and then go to a theater box office on Broadway and do all these things which normally don't make any sense to string them all together. But that's not proof that I'm doing intelligence, right?
Yeah.
So when we did this practice run in Moscow, this the guys that were coming after me, they did what the Americans do. They would put wigs on and change clothes, and there's a one time. By the way, every one of those exercises, when I had a tail, I found out. So they were really annoyed, because they had the task to follow me for 3 hours not be detected, and my task was to find them, and I always did. So I was declared one of the best students in that business. But one time I got fooled by a guy.
I love this story, by the way. I love this. Go ahead.
When in Moscow in those days, it was quite normal to ask strangers for a cigarette, or because cigarettes were so cheap. I'm standing there waiting for a bus, and a guy comes up to me and says, can I have a cigarette? And then he says, can you give me a light? and this guy he was so normal. I had no, and I was, and afterwards it was disclosed to me that he was one of the team. That is masterful surveillance.
Yeah, I agree. You don't get to break the rules often, but if you know what the rules are and you have a capacity for in the field improvisation, no spy is ever going to engage another spy while on surveillance. So if you worry that you're exposed, you can literally walk up to that person, make eye contact, and go and engage them and say something and walk away. But you've got to be excellent at the craft to be able to get away with that. Yeah, it's such a great story. That you tell that story also on Jordan's show, and you guys really do got to check out Jack's 2-parter on the Art of Charm, because it's just fantastic. And I knew right away, and I'm like, I got to have Jack on my show, because again, when do you get to have guys like us, exchanging notes on the field? Because you're right, we come at this different ways. You're more strategic, I'm more tactical. You're more of like the spy, I'm more of the spy catcher. One of the things that I say openly was I was a spy, and everybody loses their mind at that. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this. If I go to a foreign place where I'm clearly not part of the people there, Middle Eastern example, applies for sure. I'm not going to hide that I'm there, because if I go backpacking innocently in Iran, I'm a spy to every person that encounters me, every single one. So I don't hide it. I'm like, I'm here to find things out. If I ask a question that you don't like, don't answer it. And they're like, okay. And then I never ask a question that's nefarious, because I focus on building trust, and then my network pumps me information. Like I just build a pump that will send me information over and over again, and I do it in the open. I'm with guys that wear uniforms. I'm not on the strategic end. I'm tactical. I've got to build trust fast. I've got to, I may never see this person again. I may see them 10 times, and that would be a lot. So I don't need to be sneaky. I need to be honest and build trust. What are your thoughts on being open with how you, obviously you've got a different game, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, that is dictated by the circumstances you're in. You couldn't possibly blend in. You look different. You talk with an accent, assuming that you even have a command of the language. I was trained and I was built to sort of blend in. You know, half of the population of the United States traces its origin back to Germany. So yeah, no big deal. And I have a bit of an accent, but that was easy to explain by having had a German-speaking mother. And so, yeah, I was secret beyond the point where the FBI discovered me. I didn't come out of the closet until about 3 years ago.
Yeah, you had to, for your own, on both sides, you had to protect yourself from being caught and captured by us here in the U.S., but you also had to protect yourself against a very, I would say your guys' organization in Russia, back when you were working with the KGB, they're much more punitive and lethal.
They
with their
were,
own
and
people.
here's may I volunteer something that quite delicious.
Please.
It wasn't in the book because it happened after the book appeared. I met the man who could have possibly, if our timelines had overlapped a little more, who could have possibly signed my death sentence. He was
Wow.
chief of counterintelligence for the first directorate of the KGB, Mr. Oleg Kalugin, who, by the way, is now an American citizen. You know, there's a bunch of bizarre things that happened in my life, and they're still happening after the book come out.
Yeah.
You can't escape your past.
You can't, and you often find out things, because I've recently found out some things about my experience that I never could have known, never would have bothered to have known, but I had to get close with the Taliban, you know, and it takes time, and I'm not always in the same area, and I bounce around, but I ended up being in a meeting that was called by the Taliban. So I was set up to go to a meeting. This all happens outside of my knowledge. And brought to that because they wanted to talk to this scholar, this man that everybody said was respectable but was an American, because they were trying to they were kind of collecting on me. Now, I had nothing to offer other than my honest, you know, because I was honest, because I was doing a scholarly kind of activity. When they interacted with me, I was validated. So I went from being a target that they only wanted to kill to someone that they were curious about enough to meet. And so I wanted to accomplish this meeting with the Taliban. And ultimately, when I heard back from one of the guys that was doing the intel there, like, they saw me, they met me, they set it up, and they were impressed with my sales pitch that I was, you know, the scholar that was asking questions to find things out. They did that. I had no idea I was in that meeting. I had no idea that maybe that meeting was going to go south. Maybe that was going to be meeting that led to the decision. Definitely going to target this guy because he's an American. Because I often didn't wear a uniform. I often didn't carry a weapon because I needed to distance. Even though I was authorized, I needed to distance myself a little bit from my patrol that I was with, so that I was able to do something else. So that was sort of my cover was, yes, I'm here asking questions. I'm always going to do that, but I'm this benevolent, scholarly type guy.
Your control was in the same space physically. This is like depicted in the Americans. I never met a person who worked for the KGB on American soil, with one exception when the guy told me that you better come home or else. But that was like last minute, like highest emergency. Otherwise, there was never a meeting, and that was part of the hard and fast rules of conspiracy here.
Yeah, no, it's definitely different. On the other hand, I'm sort of, and I don't want to say saddled, I have this obstacle that I have to overcome because I have a gun crew with me. You know, and I have to, it's so impermissive there, I have to have them. So I've got to find ways to deal with that. And there are other people collecting intel in the area also, and I can't step on their feet. So it's a completely different paradigm, you know, where you're on your own, not sure who to trust, you know, and I can't even imagine the logistical nightmare. For those of you guys that don't know, a surveillance program is hours for a short meeting, a short interaction. It's almost kind of funny. I understand why you have to do accounting and finance in your reports, But that's the time when you're most vulnerable, when you send information or when you conduct a meeting. Like that's when that's when they want to catch you. That's when the illegal stuff happens. And here they are like, we need the financial report. Like that. Couldn't that be just a dead drop somewhere or something? No, it's got to be done, through this encrypted means or whatever.
Yep. Everything. And with regard to when you talk about encryption, even though I wrote secret writing, any information that was still in secret writing that could identify a person, that be name, address, phone number, whatever, was all encrypted. So we had a double safety there. If somebody were to be able to intercept the letter and actually find out, develop it, you still couldn't make any sense of it.
One of the things in the movies, and I get why, because it's a part of the storytelling for the movie, but in reality, it's much different. If I'm writing something for what's called the audience, it's called a one-time pad. It's basically a way of setting up a code that someone else knows and how to break it. It's sort of like Enigma if you've watched the movies.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business, or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show, where we both know how to translate off our message. So if I've got this thing, I've got it, like you said, I've got to write it. I might have to write it 3 times to get everything set up. What I'm not going to do is leave those pages below the pad on the pad. Those get destroyed as well, because I know that can be exploited to discover what I've done. So in the movies, they always show that, the detective come up at the side of the pencil and they scratch out what's there and they read the imprint on the paper. Never, ever, ever going to happen if you've got a spy that knows their business, because we're going to get rid of those pages as well. It's all compromisable. We're always looking to reduce risk, reduce the ability
well,
to be compromised.
let me go a step further. When
Yes.
with regard to imprinting the letter and doing this, adding the secret writing, I had to hold it over some steam to make sure, and I would look at it at an angle in light to make sure there was no trace that there was something else on top of it, whether it was readable or not.
Right.
It was supposed to be as smooth as possible, except for the official, the writing that was written with a ballpoint pen. No other marks.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing. At that level of detail has to be required. That level of detail also enables you to learn certain patterns that become some of the tools that you use. I know from doing surveillance, champagne-colored cars, kind of goldish, deserty tone cars, are really invisible. They don't stand out like other cars. What are some of the things you've picked up where like, oh, this is a human truth, where, this helps me to, this enables me to be less visible? Because in general, I'm always trying to be, in the case of surveillance, I'm always trying to be less visible. I'm using reflections in windows to watch you, whatever I can do to be less focal for you. What are some of those things that you picked up along the way?
I can't answer the question with regard to surveillance, but with regard to, blending in, the one thing that I found out very quickly, when somebody asks you a question that ventures into potentially dangerous territory, you answer with conviction very quickly and decisively, and typically that ends the conversation. Because I had a backstory, I had a cover story, and that wouldn't have held up to scrutiny. But it had enough in it that if the, for instance, about the accent. So how come you sound a little like a foreigner? Well, my mother and I, we spoke a lot of German until about the age of 2. When she died, I made her die, and that ended the conversation.
Right. No, and that's exactly right. Like, those things are going to come up, and you just have to be ready to have that answer. I mean, you have an accent. Again, like if I'm in a foreign place where everybody else is a different complexion than me, I have to understand that they see me as a spy already. how do I engage that barrier? And I'm honest. Yes, I'm asking questions. I'm here to find things out.
And you think you did that too. You got to run through in your mind before you even step onto the scene all kinds of different scenarios, all kinds of questions that may come, and you should have an answer ready, particularly when the answer is not the truth, because you want to be as convincing as possible. And if a lie that you just make up on the spot, unless you are an accomplished liar, will be discovered as such. But if you practice this ahead of time, I practice. You read the book. I practiced the interview at the Social Security office several days in a row, out loud, until I believed what I said.
Yeah, an accomplished liar can pull it off because the work has already been done. You've already done the practice. You've already done these kinds of lies. You already know what you have to say. And on our side of the game, we call it cover for status, cover for action. One is like, why are you standing here all day? Oh, I'm here at my truck and I've got the hood up. This enables me to stand here for a long time, be flustered, look at things, right? That allows me to do it. These are the things you have to have ready to go. Even if the lie is the truck hood being up, that's a lie. My truck's really not disabled. If you come and try to help me start my car won't start because I've handled that. But
so what we have in common here is the ability to project into the future and run scenarios before they actually happen. By the way, I'm living with somebody who can't do that, and even in daily life, and sometimes it gets very frustrating.
Yeah, I bet, because we do think about these things, and I've had to work hard to slough off a lot of that stuff. Part of that, re-indoctrination into the real world is getting rid of some of those tendencies. My limbic, my animal brain always senses danger. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to get out of this world, because so this is a funny story. I'm doing a surveillance gig and we get a security briefing prior to going to Colorado. I can't say a whole lot more than that, but we're going to go to Colorado and watch folks from the Asian continent. And the briefing is on extreme terrorism in Germany.
Oh.
Okay, we're so worried about threat. We're talking about something that has literally nothing to do. And if there is a link between the two things, great. But let me know what that link is. Don't just give me a threat brief on the status of German extremists, or Islamist literalists in Germany. I need to know what threats there are where I'm going, and that's the problem with our world is everybody sees a threat in everything. I've got friends that don't take the picture. Dude, you're fine. I have another friend, and I give him a hard time openly, so I can say this on the show. He did some work in Cuba. He's like, I can't go to Cuba, bro. I can't go there. I'm like, come on. Nobody cares that you're going. He's like, yeah, but all the work I did. And I'm like, okay. It wasn't on the Cubans. You have no current placement and access. Why, they're not gonna waste their resources on you. They're gonna waste their resources on someone that currently has something that they can.
Yeah, so that really opens the door for me to ask that question, because I have been asked that question myself many times. Were you ever really afraid, or were you always afraid?
I wasn't really ever afraid. I had made the decision in my mind that my fate was largely out of my hands, that if someone chose there to be a bad day, whether it was caused by me, caused by the patrol, or it was just the next thing that comes down the road's going to get blown up, I can't control those things. So I allowed that to not be a problem. It doesn't mean that I ignored risk, and I have been in host national officials' cars, completely away from Americans, going and doing work that you can't do with the gun crew with you. So I've put myself intelligently done. I've put myself into their car, gone miles away from my camp with a radio that may or may not work. You can only do that if you accept that your fate is not in your hands, and the bigger picture, my sacrifice of my safety to make sure that the post is safe is the greater thing. Am I scared? Oh, also, I should say this too, and I don't know where you were in this, Jack, so I'm interested in your comments, but I had made a decision when deployed, if I reach a point where I realize that something bad may happen, I wanted to be the first to act. I wanted to act decisively. I wanted to act with murderous action because that might be the last opportunity to do that. And I didn't want to hesitate too long, but I wanted to have like a trip point where I would take the encounter from a 2 or a 3 all the way up to an 11 and then back it back down, once it happened. So once I got into that high zone, I'm like, I'm in a zone now where if things start to go sideways, I'm starting the gunfight. So was I scared? There were times where I did not know what the outcome was going to be for certain. It all worked out because we were good at trust, because we were good at friends. But certainly I had to put myself into situations that 99% of the time other people would not do it because it pulled it off as well too. I have to be honest in that. I was good at this. So yes, afraid is possible, but more importantly, was I prepared and had I already done the work?
See, I understand this answer, but a lot of quote unquote normal people don't. How could you do this without being scared? And my standard answer is, if you are going into this kind of an activity in fear, you will fail immediately.
Right. Yes. Yeah. This is one of the things too. However and I used to train counterintelligence people on how to run sources. And one of the things I always said was, understand the doctrine so that when you work away from it, you're doing so by design. And also understand that however you need to approach this for you to be comfortable is how you need to do it. I'm going to learn from your guys. That's one of the things about being the teacher is you get to master all these different tools. But I would watch how they did things, and my job was to make it challenging for them so that when life got challenging, they had already felt some discomfort, and I would make them uncomfortable. That was the main thing I tried to teach them was, all this doctrine stuff is great, but I'm going to make you make decisions in an instant. I'm going to push your plan so that you understand what it takes for you to be comfortable. I do this in interviews. Same thing happens. I have to talk through what I think might happen so I can surrender all of it and know that I'm prepared and comfortable.
Yep. So, and it gets to be a bit humorous, but sometimes this is not as humorous, but for instance, I was more afraid of reconnecting with my son who I had deserted when he was 5 years old than I was afraid ever of anything that could happen to me in the U.S. because you just in the book, I call this sort of, I forgot what I use, but it's like, this is maybe an odd expression, but it's almost like you're covering yourself with a psychological condom that makes you impenetrable to doubt. And it makes you impenetrable to thoughts of what happens if this goes bad, because it can't go bad.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's yes.
Sorry.
I wish I
Sorry
knew
about that word. I hope that's okay to be used.
No, you're 100% fine. I'm laughing because I'm thinking of all the context that's required. We're having this conversation that's fascinating. And by the way, I'm talking with Jack Barsky, the author of Deep Undercover. He's a world-class guest. You have to watch his segment on 60 Minutes. You have to listen to Art of Charm with Jordan Harbinger because they did a fantastic two-parter. We are purposely avoiding all that stuff because the opportunity for us to exchange notes is just too great. And I definitely want to have you back on because we can do this all day. I wanted to ask you about placement and access. As someone who has to go out and find I'm assuming that you had to find human sources as well as photographic evidence, that kind of thing. But did you guys on your end, do you focus on placement and access for somebody? We try to preach the thing like we're not going to create placement and access. You want someone that works in the government so that you can create the reason for you to get, at least by proxy, into that building that you can't get into easily. How do you approach those things?
You hit on something absolutely key, and I talk about this nowadays when I speak at sort of cybersecurity events and information technology gatherings when I talk about the insider threat. And typically the insider is not the highly trained agent. The insider is somebody who's already there and who's being recruited. And the corollary of that is that the insider is really not a highly trained agent and can be discovered with some basic preventive measures. So you're absolutely right. My directive was to get to know interesting people. Hopefully, and that was a pipe dream, people who work in government or in think tanks. And I made the mistake by mentioning the then National Security Advisor who just passed away not too long ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Right.
And I know how to pronounce that name.
Yeah, you're better than me. I'm glad you said it.
Because he was a thorn in the side of the Soviet Union in those days. And if you could get close to him or somebody who was close to him, that would be really great. Now, that was a pipe dream based on my lowly standing in society at the time. I made the mistake of mentioning Brzezinski in 60 Minutes, and all of a sudden it's all over the place, including in Wikipedia, that I had that task to get acquainted with Mr. Brzezinski. No. This was open-ended. Find interesting people. It was never sort of a checklist. You could this one. Do whatever you can. People, context. That was the mantra.
Yes.
And it was never about me getting into institutions, organizations where I could actually steal the secrets myself, simply because a background check a thorough background check would have potentially discovered that I was not who I pretended to be.
Yeah, I always say you count out Iraq and Iraqi, you count out Afghan and Afghan. You also can't out, Department of Energy, a Department of Energy person. They are that thing. So, as a spy, I'm going to exploit them in some way. I'm going to find some kind of emotional trigger. I'm going to find some kind of financial or something that I can leverage. Even if it's a soft leverage, I'm going to try to compel them to do this thing that I want them to do. And this is really where the difference is between I ask questions and I get information. But you're right. I want someone, I use the East German example. Like, there's a guy in Berlin who tunes pianos, and that guy is so innocuous, he can hop back and forth across the wall and just tune pianos. But everybody... And so my friend, and I want to introduce you guys, my friend Mark Valley, who's a co-host on the show. He also has his own Cold War Stasi kind of podcast where he's exploring that whole world. So for sure, I want to get you over there to talk to him. But we talk about, one of the guests talked about Berlinery. And I try to explain Berlinery by saying there's not just double agents, there's triple agents. There's not just counter surveillance, there's counter surveillance. And the Brits are watching the Americans because they're watching the Russian who's watching the Brits. And then the French guy shows up. And then that whole time that piano maker is going, or tuner is going back and forth across Checkpoint Charlie or whatever it's going to be. And everybody wants to know what that guy's doing, and yet he's doing nothing. And so there's like this whole storm of things, and everybody sees each other watching each other, and it's hilarious.
Speaking of triple agents, there's one story. This is a real story. If I can recommend a book here, and I have no affiliation with the author or publisher or whatever, but I just read it and I think it's delicious, and it speaks to triple agency. It's called Agent Zigzag. It's about a low-level criminal in England who gets who gets recruited by MI6, and then he gets recruited by the Nazis, and it goes back and forth, and at the end it's all about his survival, but you don't know who his real master is. That world that we operated in can be incredibly bizarre, like a dream, like the Twilight Zone, when you say, am I really here? Is this real? For instance, most of the people that I interacted with, my handlers, my trainers, or whatever, you would introduce yourself. Oh, my name is such and such, and they would give a name, and you knew that it wasn't their name, and they knew that it wasn't yours. So it's, again, we gotten back. You use that word many times. It's a world the glue of this world is trust. If trust does not exist, the world falls apart.
Yeah, and someone can take your trust from you who's never met you or anything. There can literally be someone wearing a uniform who decides they don't like your work, or they get a hunch that you've flipped or something, and all of a sudden you wind up dead, because someone who has no idea says this and they're convincing. So you're always trying to be above reproach with everything. I was very careful on how I wrote my reports, because if I have compelling information, if it's too sticky, if it's too delicious, the unit will act on it inappropriately, because the Army always over responds and dominates. That's their culture. So I always had to write this in a way where I'm like, this is something that you don't need to do anything about. Just know this exists.
Yeah.
And let's not storm in and kill it. How about you, when you had to write, did you have to, I know you didn't get a lot of feedback, but how did your job color your writing?
Which job? The job my job?
Your spy job. You know what, Bo? I don't know. However you want to answer that. I'm curious as to your civilian jobs.
It's a funny
fourth
thing.
and fifth graders.
Over time, I started to have opinions. Initially, when one of my tasks was to write reports about the mood among Americans and opinions about concerning certain situations in the world and events. And initially, I would just summarize what I heard, based on the people that I knew. And I never used the New York Times as a source and so forth. That the diplomats could do that. But over time, I became somewhat opinionated and inserted my own opinion when I figured, well, you guys, you shouldn't have done this. And I did this in a sort of in a way that it wasn't quite obvious. I didn't say I am thinking, but the one event that sticks to my mind was the downing of the Korean airliner. I don't know if you're old enough to remember that.
Sure.
Nowadays, there's some indication that the CIA actually provoked this whole thing, but in those days, it created a phenomenal backlash amongst Americans, and I hammered the Central Committee. I says, you guys, I didn't say it in strong words, you shouldn't have done this, because we were just doing so well with détente and so forth, and now you just bombed us 10 years backwards. This is all exaggerated language I'm using now, but it's almost impossible, and this is now I'm stepping back and giving more of a generic answer. Almost impossible to not introduce your own self into what you're reporting.
First off, let me say this to give you some color from our side. Back in '83, when that plane was shot down, I remember hearing the words, and this is Reagan era for us. This might be the first shot fired in World War III. And as a kid who's in his early teens, you're like, oh man, I'm just getting started here. Let's not that's not in the world. So for sure the hyperbole was flying in that case. And yeah, who does trigger this? Is this the CIA making something happen so that they can gain an advantage somewhere else? Because it is a strategic game. I'm curious. I want to change topics a little bit as we finish up, and I do appreciate your time. And maybe we can't cover all this, but I'm curious your thoughts on North Korea. As guys that do what we do, I caution my friends to, every day that goes by, there's a Pete or a Jack that's on the ground or as close to the ground as they can safely get, and they've got sacks of money, and they're working on building an end game from just that one perspective. There's a lot of other angles that get covered, but if you had to, obviously in our where you're at now, you wouldn't do this, but if you were to run agents or run a program there, how would you approach something like North Korea, where it is so closed off, it is non-permissive, but you have to do the job? What are your just high-level thoughts?
I think with regard to recruiting somebody for what is fundamentally a suicide mission, you would have to have somebody who is super patriotic, in other words, a South Korean, and
Right.
I think or, but it's probably both. Somebody whose family members are there and are being hurt or have been hurt. Somebody who has a deep-seated sense of mission to do damage to that nasty regime. It's all the other incentives for somebody to spy, such as money or even extortion or whatever, the blackmail, none of that should work, because this is probably the most dangerous territory for an agent that you can imagine. This guy kills on sight. Having said that, you're right. I believe there may be some people there, and I believe that eventually it might be possible to pull the trigger. And I also believe we're not pulling the trigger because I don't think you get rid of that guy that the regime fundamentally will collapse and change. When Stalin died, the Soviet Union didn't radically change. The folks that followed him were less dictatorial, but they still were a strong enemy of the United States. So.
Yeah, that, like you said, and you've talked about it on Jordan's thing, you've talked about it in your writing and everything else, that indoctrination, that inculcation of this is how we do things, and closing off, what was it called where you grew up in East Germany, like the Valley of the Silent or something?
Where you couldn't get West German television.
Yeah, these are the things that make that regime change a real problem. And as much as my hawkish friends, and rightfully so, have a military desire to do these things, guys like us are like, well, there's actually people on the ground that are trying to figure this out. And honestly, the status quo improved a little bit is better than having no leader and these, and the next strong man rises up, because that guy might be more crazy. So it's sort of like the devil that we've got is better than who we might get.
Yes,
in the future.
and it took the Soviet Union almost 40 years to eventually collapse after Stalin died. So change is possible, but if you're dealing with a totally indoctrinated population, they're all your enemy.
And so I guess let me ask you this then. Growing up with the indoctrination, you were able to overcome it. You've accepted faith. You've become an American citizen. How long does that take for you to finally say, I know you had your big moment where you had to decide between your German life and your American life, and you ultimately decided to stay on the American side. But how long does that take the average person? Were you exceptional in your speed? Were you slow to change over?
No,
what do you think?
Well, first of all, my decision to remain here was a private decision. It had nothing to do with systems. It had nothing to do with countries. It would be very convenient for me to say, well, I determined that America was a better country. That is not the case. I had the luxury of very slowly to decontaminate, so to speak, and grow into who I am now. And I have a really good way of comparing this to folks who didn't have that luxury, such as my old friends in East Germany, who all of us, who had served the state faithfully, and all of a sudden were left naked when the wall came down. They have had the hardest time changing, and it literally have not, most of them, to a point where here's the thing. If you spend most of your life serving a cause that eventually turned out to be not only on the losing side, but probably also on the immoral side, it is very difficult to actually admit that to yourself. I had the opportunity to work myself out of this and sort of make amends to the extent you can make amends with the time you have left on this planet. I thank God that I had this opportunity. Otherwise, I would be one of those folks who are either still communists or are just finding all kinds of explanations why they weren't really wrong.
I'm leaving a pause there because I'm not sure there's anything else we need to talk about in this episode. That's such a strong ending point. I want to remind everybody, jackbarsky.com. You guys have got to read his book. It's so good. You've got to listen to the Jordan Harbinger Art of Charm podcast with him. There's 2 episodes. For sure, hit me up at Pete A. Turner. I'm glad to guide you. I'm glad to answer questions. I know there's going to be a million questions for us, and they're gonna want to know more because we've really gotten to a place that a lot of other you just can't get to in other shows because you and I have the background to talk about this. When I listen to the Jordan episode, I'm like, oh my god, there's so much stuff to talk about, and I really would love to have you come back on. Let me make sure I plug your book here one more time though before we wrap things up. Deep Undercover. I cannot recommend a book any more highly. This is stuff. It's impossible what Jack has done. It's impossible. And the story will absolutely captivate you. There are certain books in my queue that I can always pull up and read something out of again and again and again. And yours is certainly one of them. So I really appreciate your time. I appreciate the work that you've done, and you know how I mean that specifically. And I like that you're around to give us all these stories because, you know, hard dudes like us that have done hard things can become something else. And I like the middle-aged, Americanized, middle-class Jack because that guy is he's a whole lot safer and has to do a whole lot less dangerous things.
So
thank you for coming on the show.
I appreciate having me on. And if indeed you have questions that are coming from your listeners, I'd be glad to rejoin you again and deal with those.
Yeah, for sure. And then next time you come on too, maybe I'll hand the mic over to you a little more, and you can hammer me with questions because I'm dying to see what you would come up with. So let's for sure plan on doing
but there's only one caveat. You are still subject to some restrictions, and sometimes you can't give a complete answer.